Okay, welcome back to Neuroethics Learning Collaborative, the class on applied ethics and neuroethics. This is going to be a bit of a tag team. Autumn Fiester is going to continue lecturing, lead a little discussion with the group, and then I will come in at the end and just try to relate this to neuroethics and to the remainder of the course.
So the first question in applied ethics is there something called applied ethics? And there are people who take the position that there is something special or different about applied ethics in terms of the foundational framework, but most people don't think that what we did in the section on philosophical ethics is changed when we do applied ethics. It's just that the subject matter, what we're focusing on changes when we do applied ethics. So we're using those frameworks to think through ethical issues in very practical fields. So for example, all of my lifeboat, deserted island, kill one for a billion, that's all gone because now we're on the ground and we're actually thinking through real problems in real places, in real professions. But how are we going to think them through? The moral philosopher thinks you're going to think them through either as a consequentialist or a deontologist. Now, there are political versions, macro kind of concerns sometimes in both consequentialist and deontological frameworks, which we didn't talk about, but those are just the macro versions of micro processes. So again, even when you're at the macro level, it's still deontology or consequentialism. It's just that the kind of problems you're dealing with are actually going to be practical and real and based very much in a particular profession. So if it's business ethics, you might be thinking about whether your company is justified pushing forward a particular product even though you know it has some type of harm that might be involved in it, some type of car, for example, that will have a great amount of profit and a great amount of benefit maybe, but it could have some small number of mishaps. That would be one kind of concern for a company. Or what does it mean for relationships among personnel in a company? Can there be romantic relationships? Or what about professional relationships or some kind of obligations that involve personnel? Lots of different issues for each of these fields. Legal ethics, how far does attorney-client privilege go, and what does it mean if you find one of your colleagues to be incompetently representing a client, or let's say, in the law or in the environment, how far do you go to protect the natural resources? What kind of costs can you absorb? Those would be the kind of questions that would be very real, not hypothetical, not thought experiment, but you would still employ one of those frameworks. In bioethics, we don't have to think generally tonight. We can think about cases, and so I've brought you a few that we can take a look at. I'm going to read that case to you, and I'm going to start by highlighting the kind of concerns that a consequentialist would think of, the kind of concerns that a deontologist would think of, and maybe the overlap. What I want to stress, though, is that it's not that all consequentialists will come to the same view of the case, or that all deontologists would come to the same view of the case, and it's not true that a consequentialist and a deontologist would disagree in the answer to a case. This is about processes. It could turn out to be the case, as for example, in my own center, there's a great amount of agreement on particular cases between the consequentialists and the deontologists, even though the reasoning to get there could look quite different. But I do want to highlight the kind of considerations or aspects of the case that would be salient in one camp and not so salient in another. So let's look at this one. Baby boy B is a patient in the neointensive care unit. He was born immature and developed multiple complications of prematurity, including respiratory failure requiring mechanical ventilation. He also developed multi-organ system failure and a large intracranial hemorrhage, but he was not technically brain dead. His prognosis was extremely poor, and after 1 week of aggressive care, the NICU staff persuaded his parents that withdrawal of life support was in his best interest. So today the NICU staff wrote an order for the patient to be removed from the ventilator and extubated. After extubation, he would be treated with sedatives, which he was already receiving. However, the NICU nurse tells the NICU physician that baby boy B is not moving anything. Most likely, since just an hour ago, he got a dose of a paralytic, which is given when someone's on a ventilator so they don't start pulling at the tubes. That's true even in adult medicine. Because of his multi-organ system failure, however, the effect of the paralytic will be irreversible for quite a long time and could last perhaps 1 or 2 days or even longer. The parents are telling the NICU nurses and doctors that they want their preferences carried out immediately, remove their baby from the machines and let him die in peace. The NICU has no empty beds, but it has 2 neonates at other hospitals on waiting lists for potentially treatable conditions if they were transferred to the hospital's NICU. The NICU staff refuses to remove the baby from the ventilator while still paralyzed, since they say that doing so would constitute euthanasia. So let's look at a couple of the concerns. One of the concerns that should immediately jump out at you as being consequentialist in flavor is the concern about the neonates who are waiting for the bed. Because whether this baby has a baby boy B, has his ventilator withdrawn now or in 2 days, this baby is not going to survive. And I'll give you an explanation of why the paralytic is an issue at all. But the outcome is certain. So whether the outcome is today or in 2 days, the outcome is certain and it isn't good. The baby will die. But those neonates waiting for the beds may not die if this baby has his ventilator removed today. So there is a concern about scarce resources and about all of the benefit that could come to those 2 babies. Not just to those babies and the fact that they would survive, which would have tremendous implications for their parents and their loved ones, but at what level of survival you get. Because the more aggressive, the higher the tech support you're getting in the NICU, and the more dexterous or experienced your NICU personnel, the fewer side effects and ramifications you have. So it's not just about surviving, it's all of the implications for the baby's long-term prognosis, learning disabilities, deafness, blindness, breathing issues, GI issues, is a whole host of issues that really depend on their severity on whether you've been treated with a state-of-the-art NICU or not. So the implications for the other 2 neonates are extraordinary, whereas the benefit to this baby boy B, is not going to be any greater today or in 2 days. There is no claim that there's going to be more benefit. There is certainly no claim of any benefit to the parents, and there is no claim of any tangible benefit to the NICU staff. So on a benefit analysis, the consequentialists would be getting very upset at even the suggestion that this ought to be happening. But deontologists don't make macro rationing decisions in the micro. And what I mean by that is, deontologists will recognize that there is a justice claim here. But justice claims are to be decided on policy level bases. When you have a patient in front of you, of infinite value, as human beings are, then you are dealing with an entity of infinite value, and you are dealing with the moral obligations that govern persons, and you are not doing rationing at the bedside. So it's one of the places where deontology really struggles, because it's not that a deontologist can't recognize that on a cost-benefit analysis, it's really a no-brainer that we need to get the other 2 babies in here and get them start getting their care moving forward. But deontologists are going to operate under the principles that govern interactions between clinicians and patients. And one of them is do no harm. Now, of course, there is going to be a bad outcome here. The baby is going to die. So what is the difference if you're withdrawing a ventilator now or in 2 days? The principle at play here is that our bodies are our own, and when we are competent adults, we are allowed to decide that we do not want unwanted medical care. When you have a child, you don't have a competent adult, but you have a parent or a surrogate who steps in as if that adult were the patient and decides for the patient. So it's the same principle involved. I decide what happens to my body, and when I have a child at play, there is a surrogate. And if surrogates are acting in the best interest of the child, which they almost always are, if they're not, there's a legal battle that would ensue to remove the parent as a surrogate. But in general, the principle that a deontologist would operate under is the baby should not have care that is not wanted. But when a paralytic is on board, when they have given a particular drug that has made it impossible for the baby to breathe, the underlying principle that it's the disease that terminates the life, which is how withdrawal of ventilators are justified, becomes worrisome, because it's the drug that the clinicians have given that is actually going to stop the baby from having any possibility of spontaneous breathing. It's not the underlying disease. In other words, if you haven't paralyzed the baby's lungs, then when the ventilator is removed, those lungs will not start automatically, though one time they actually did. In a very famous case of ventilator withdrawal, the lungs actually did spontaneously start, and that was Ann Quinlan. She lived in a fetal position for 8 years after her ventilator was removed. The landmark case that secured for all of us in the United States the ability to have our ventilator removed actually ended up having the result that this woman was in a fetal position for 8-9 years. Finally died of pneumonia. So it does sometimes happen. No one thinks it's going to happen in the case of this baby, but what justifies the removal of the support of ventilation is that the diseased body can't support ventilating the body. But when you've actually put a drug on board that means that you have caused the body not to breathe, then the concern becomes, have I killed the baby rather than the disease? Now, deontologists are going to disagree, as the nurses and the doctors are disagreeing in this particular case. It doesn't fall in the line of nurses or doctors. I mean, many doctors and many nurses will take both sides. But for some deontologists, the principle that it's a drug that's going to kill the baby when the ventilator is removed is the reason why they don't want the ventilator removed until this is all settled. Now, the parents could be deontologists and still say whether the lungs are not moving because of a disease or the lungs are not moving because of a drug makes no difference. The lungs are not going to move. And we have to remember that in the Ann Quinlan case, it wasn't her lungs that were damaged. She had a brain injury. She was in a persistent vegetative state. This is a child whose main organs are not functioning. So it's not that the nurses in this case think the baby's going to breathe when the ventilator's removed. It's just that they don't want any concern about the causal agent in that baby's death. So that's what I see when I look at the case, when I think about how deontologists and consequentialists will look at the case. Is there anything else you're seeing that you want to think about here in the case? So some deontologists are going to be bothered by the paralytic and some are not. Consequentialists are going to be very concerned about the fact that there's another baby waiting for the bed. That isn't going to be their only concern. They're going to think about something a deontologist is probably going to place, some deontologists aren't going to place enough weight on, I think, and that is the anguish and the suffering of those 2 days in those parents. So the parents want closure. If they don't want their baby to die, they want their baby to survive, but that's not going to be possible. So now in terms of maximizing the well-being of all parties, watching, it's like holding a death vigil for 2 solid days when they've already had a week of it. They want to start healing, they want to start getting beyond it, so that's another thing that the consequentialists are going to look at. The deontologists are going, some deontologists are going to think about that as well, thinking about what we owe parents in terms of a respect for the decisions that they've made and the concern about being the gatekeepers of actions they want taken, as if it's my right to keep them, as the clinician, to keep them from getting what they absolutely need. That is, do I over-prioritize my own moral center and my own moral code over the needs of folks who are going to suffer so acutely from my decision? In other words, my I may have the principle of you ought not to remove a ventilator when there's a paralytic on board, but the anguish that's going to occur when the ventilator is removed isn't going to be mine. It's the parents who are going to experience the death of the child. So ought I to be prioritizing my moral principle over the principle of we need to be empathic for parents in a tragic circumstance, or we are called to serve patients and their families, and that service requires our acknowledging that that's not the principle they're operating under. Thoughts here? Mm-hmm.
I guess, as you were mentioning with the deontologists, they would have a policy-based reasoning where, for example, if the rules do no harm, but why would they be, or I guess there's a preference here, but then by not letting by letting the baby stay 2 days longer, aren't they doing harm on the 2 babies that are not?
Okay, right. So the question is, when we think about harm, why would a deontologist be only focused on the harm of the patient in front of her as opposed to the patients that are not in front of her? That is one of the concerns that consequentialists have with deontologists, which is that they carve out ever-widening circles about who matters and in what intensity folks matter.
Can you just explicitly say for the camera that it's the 2 babies who are waiting to get...
The 2 babies who are in outside community hospitals who are waiting for the high-tech NICU and the harm that's going to come to them as opposed to the baby that's actually in the NICU and is going to have the ventilator removed. So one answer to this question is that deontologists think about the nearest and dearest as demanding, commanding our highest obligations. So you think about, for example, the people that you have made vows to, like your spouse, or in a lighter sense, perhaps your boyfriend or girlfriend. Certainly when you have committed to having a child and you've decided to keep the child as opposed to give the child up for adoption, or you've carried that pregnancy to term and now there is a child, special obligation to adhere to the children. And then you think about your closest friends and your parents and your siblings. And different folks have different intensities depending on the way those relationships have gone and the reciprocality of them. And then you have the people that you have made some other type of commitment to. For example, I've committed to teach this class tonight. That means that as students tonight, you have priority over any other students of mine tonight in this time frame. But then when I go to my office tomorrow, all of the students who are in the Master of Bioethics program will have priority over any other students who might come to the door, and it widens out like that. So when you have a patient, your commitment is part of the doctor-patient relationship. You have committed to treating that patient. And that means that in your world, there is just that patient. You're the doctor, that's the patient. That's the relationship and the obligations that hold and your responsibility. It's somebody else's job to have commitments to those other babies. Hospital administrators, people who set policies for the NICU, maybe the society in general, third-party payers, I don't know. But as a doctor, my obligation is to that patient. I made a commitment to this baby, baby boy B. I don't know baby C and baby D. It's not that there is no one who ought to worry about it, but it's no one in the NICU ought to be worried about it, because in the NICU, for a deontologist, the commitments have been made to these babies. Now, maybe hospital administrators want to make a policy that says, if aggressive care is not working, stop the paralytics. Or if aggressive care is working and not working and you want a paralytic, withdraw anyway. Or if you are in a situation where you see no improvement in 5 days, that baby needs to be moved to a step-down unit. I have no idea what policy you want to create, but that's at the macro level. That's not at my relationship to that baby.
So what in the case, like a skilled physician, where there would be, one child who has something that's kind of minor that's wrong with them, and another child, for example, that has something very wrong with them, and the one that has something that's maybe not so wrong with them could be treated by another physician. Mm-hmm. But the one who has something very wrong but is not currently being seen by a skilled physician would benefit only from having a skilled physician. What kind of, where,
So the question is, let's say that you have someone who is less severely injured and much more severely injured, or needs minor care, maybe nurse practitioner care versus skilled surgical care. You made them both clinicians. It doesn't matter. I think the example work in any way at all. The question is, what does the individual clinician do? Well, in one sense, we've already worked that through. That's called triage, and we have macro principles for it. I, as the doctor in the emergency room, do not make that decision. There's a triage process, so that if you come in and you have, you got in a little fist fight, and so you have a little cut that needs some stitches, and someone comes in with a heart attack, even if you have been put in a room, when the heart attack comes, you're going to be moved if there's only one room, because that's triage. But it's not that I'm going to sever my relationship to you. I am going to still see you. I'm going to see you when I can after the triage process takes place. So we have already figured out, and in war situations, there is even a different triage. In an emergency room triage, it's a macro process that says you treat the sickest first. But in a war triage, you treat the salvageable first, and the ones that you don't think have a high likelihood of being saved, you just let die on the battlefield. So there are two different triage processes for the macro. But in neither case do I go, well, I'm better friends with you, but you were married to my sister, or my brother, or whatever. It's not about me. It's a macro policy level. Deontologists can deal with macro principles, but they're not supposed to be in the hands of folks with special obligations. And if I have committed to sew up that cut that you got from your fist fight, if I have a doctor-patient relationship set up with you because I already came in, went over the problem, told you what needed to be done, I can't say, oh, you know what, we're all tired, we're going out for a beer, goodbye. I must treat you. And if it's not going to be me, I need to hand over your care to someone else who can do it. But my handing over care to someone else does not mean that you still need the same skill set. If the skill set that's required is a much lower skill set than the one I possess, there's no reason why I can't treat you fairly and adequately by giving you someone with a lower skill set. So if what you've got is diarrhea and what you need is some type of medicine for it, I can have a nurse practitioner who works for me go to you and take care of you. Then she's my proxy. You still get the care you need.
So Autumn has taken us through all of philosophical ethics in the last lecture, the sort of very concept of applied ethics, and given us a taste of what applied ethics in different fields is about, business ethics, legal ethics, and so forth. And then some very well worked through and fascinating examples from clinical bioethics. And now there's one other kind of applied ethics that is relevant to this class, and that is neuroethics. So what I want to do in the last few minutes of this lecture is give you a little preview of the material that we'll be covering in the rest of the course, and some examples of the kinds of issues that we'll discuss and the way in which they intersect with the kinds of reasoning that we learned are called deontological and consequentialist. So neuroethics. I think for the sake of classifying a very big field into a few pots, we can say that most of the issues of neuroethics go into one of these three categories. First, there's just what neuroscientists should and shouldn't do when they are acting as neuroscientists. This is the most familiar kind of neuroethical issue that typically gets covered in ethics courses for neuroscience graduate students. And this is what we'll be talking about next time when Autumn teaches about animal and human subjects and the treatment of subjects in research. It's also what you'll be hearing about when John Merz gives his talks on regulating neuroscience. And basically it's issues like what kinds of treatments are morally permissible to give to subjects, whether they're human research subjects or animal research subjects. And as you're probably familiar with just by filling out, you know, IRB and IACUC, you know, applications here at Penn or whatever institution you're at, Wisconsin. There's a lot of risk-benefit language in these kinds of applications, and I think that is consistent with the fact that there is a strong consequentialist tradition in thinking about what's permissible to do to your research subjects. And of course, at the same time, there are you know, other kinds of moral considerations that come in too. In particular, I think one place where you can see more of a maybe a deontological flavor to the thinking is when the subjects are children or brain-injured subjects, incompetent subjects, prisoners, where we may feel certain obligations to protect those subjects' rights, even if they themselves might be willing to go along, or you know, might seem that the sacrifice that we're asking of them perhaps is not that significant, because perhaps they don't, they aren't of much value to society, whatever. We nevertheless say, well, no, it's not just about balancing risk and benefit. It's also about, you know, standing up for basic rights that that humans and possibly animals as well have. So, so you can see both the consequentialist and the deontological forms of thought informing our treatment of research subjects, and similar kinds of considerations also with you know, regulation of new drugs, devices, you know, whatever. The second category, let me just, yeah, slideshow. Oh my goodness. Were we on, there we go. The second category of topics that will really take up the biggest chunk of this course has to do with what we should and shouldn't do with applied neuroscience, with neurotechnologies, brain imaging, psychopharmacology, brain stimulation, all the different ways in which we've learned to tweak the brain or to read out information from the brain to, you know, further our goals. You know, you could, well, one example of an issue that's discussed a lot these days in neuroethics is the idea of brain enhancement, and whether that's right or wrong, or under what conditions people should or shouldn't be able to enhance their brains. Now, what I mean by enhancement is not to improve or help a brain that's injured or sick, but rather to take a normal, healthy brain and make it even better. We know that students on college campuses are enhancing their brains, improving their study ability by using certain kinds of drugs. We know that you know, in the military, soldiers, military personnel are sometimes encouraged to use medications to improve their alertness, to function better without sleep, to be better warfighters for their own protection and to get their missions accomplished. There are many different ways in society now, and even more ways looking in the not too distant future, when the fruits of neuroscience research, these abilities that we have to change brain function, are going to be used to to improve people's cognition, mood, all the different psychological functions. So, you know, is this good or bad? A lot of people have a kind of, oh, you know, yuck, that's creepy, you know, medicine should be reserved for, you know, sick people. Other people say, well, gee, that's great, you know, we want to improve ourselves, and neuroscience is giving us a whole new set of tools to improve ourselves. Well, if you look at the debates, at the literature, pro and con, which we will later in the semester, you'll see that you have people making essentially utilitarian arguments, consequentialist arguments, saying, look, you know, the risks are, if you're for enhancement, you'll say the risks are minimal and the benefits are great. You can learn more. You can, you know, have more, you know, get more work done, have more playtime. You know, life is better. So that's basically saying, that's defending the practice of brain enhancement on the basis of its good consequences. Or you might say, oh no, these things are too risky. Again, that's a consequentialist critique of brain enhancement. People are actually quite worried about the effects of enhancement, not so much on the individual who might be choosing to enhance, but on society at large. So some people worry, and I think this is not a crazy worry, that as cognitive enhancement becomes more and more common on campuses, in workplaces, that the people who would actually prefer not to change their brain chemistry for the sake of better performance are going to start to feel pressured to do so. If everybody around you is, you know, studying more efficiently and you know, pushing up that curve of student scores on which your grades are computed, then you're going to be essentially at a disadvantage because you just want to go to college and, you know, do it with your own kind of natural, unaided brain. If you're in the workplace and your boss says, look, you know, everybody else in the office has no problem pulling an all-nighter, you know, once or twice a week, you know, thanks to these wakefulness promoting drugs that we now have. You know, you got to do this too, or I'm going to hire somebody else who will do your job and take the drugs. So again, worries like that are often framed in terms of a consequentialist ethic, the idea that as enhancement becomes more common, it actually pressures other people to do things that they don't want to. On the other hand, you could take a deontological approach to these kinds of problems and say, look, people have a right to do what they want with their own bodies. And we have an obligation, you know, a moral obligation to let people do what they want with themselves. Just like, you know, the patients that Autumn was talking about who have a right to say, I don't want that ventilator. People have a right to say, you know, I want to goose up my, you know, dopamine during finals week and, you know, study super hard, and I'm not going to worry about possible, you know, side effects. I'm not going to worry about the effects on other people. That's their business. So basically, enhancement is an area of great interest in neuroethics, partly because it encompasses so many different areas of human life. We have cognitive enhancement, mood enhancement, we have sexual enhancement. You know, of course, there's Viagra. That's not really a brain drug, but testosterone definitely works via the brain. There's a new drug, it's a failed antidepressant that apparently somewhat increases libido in women, and that's now being, it's been submitted for approval to the FDA as a sexual enhancer for women. Again, it's a brain-targeted drug. Let's enhance sex life, mood, cognition, sex life. You know, you can imagine all the other ones. Wakefulness. You know, get an extra, you know, night's worth of activity in your life every week by taking one of these wakefulness enhancers. There's a lot of ways in which we can enhance our lives by tweaking our brain chemistry. And that's one reason I think brain enhancement has engendered so much interest. But another reason that I think it's a very important topic for neuroethics is that there are so many different considerations that need to be taken into account, the individual, the larger society, and there are so many different ways of looking at it, that is consequentialist, deontological, that it's really a very, very fertile ground for neuroethical thinking, development of ideas, moral theories about the right way, how much autonomy people should have over their own brain chemistry, what they choose to do with it. So that's enhancement is one of the major topics in neuroethics. Another one is brain imaging. Again, we come up with both consequentialist and deontological arguments here. Consequentialist ones being primarily, look at all the great things that you could accomplish if we could really make, brain-based lie detection work, or neuromarketing, personality, brain scanning, and so forth. Certainly in the case of brain-based lie detection, about which there have been all kinds of claims of success. In fact, there's even a couple of companies out there. Well, there's 2 companies doing fMRI-based lie detection. There are others doing ERP, electrophysiological detection of deception. There's a lot of interest in using these methods for interrogation, right? And maybe it would be a really good thing if it could avoid torturing people, if it was an alternative to that our government or other governments could use. Certainly if you could actually find out good information about terrorist plots or whatever, this would clearly be a big benefit, a big plus in the utilitarians, tally of pluses and minuses. On the other hand, we also need to think about these kinds of brain imaging systems from a deontological perspective, and in particular, in terms of our obligation to give people privacy, people's right to privacy. So again, there's a lot of grist for the neuroethics mill in this middle category of what we should and shouldn't do with neurotechnologies, psychopharm, brain imaging, actually brain stimulation, which we'll also talk about, which can also be used for enhancement. Finally, I think what you could call the neuroscience worldview also raises ethical issues, ethical and policy issues. What I mean by the neuroscience worldview is the view that basically, all of us are just, physical mechanisms. We're brains in a body, and we are no different in kind from other kinds of physical things. Animals, computers, Coke bottles, you name it, right? So Kant drew a very fundamental metaphysical distinction between persons and other kinds of things, including animals. But in some sense, neuroscience, at least to my eyes, seems to be telling us it may not be such a fundamental qualitative difference between people and other kinds of things. It may just be that people are physical things that have some very fancy computational neural networks in them. And if that's the case, if we are just really intelligent, capable, high-performance computing machines, then a lot of our intuitions about what's right and wrong get sort of undermined. I mean, for one thing, let's talk about responsibility for our actions. You know, the idea that people are moral agents is really fundamental to Kant's idea of ethics and to a lot of people's ideas of ethics and human nature. But if it turns out that everything that you do is just, you know, the result of physical processes that can be sort of traced backwards into brain function, which can in turn be traced backwards into, you know, various genes that came together at conception and directed, you know, the building of a brain and a body that was then shaped by various experiences growing up and so forth. Then how can you hold a person responsible for anything they've done any more than you can hold a, you know, car responsible when it malfunctions, or even give a car credit when it, you know, revs its engines and accelerates in a very pleasing way, right? I mean, there's no good or bad in terms of human behavior on this view. There's just really well functioning or poorly functioning. So maybe, based on this neuroscience worldview, you know, the defense lawyer should go in and say, but judge, you know, my client couldn't help himself. His brain made him do it. Or, you know, his, you know, the Big Bang made him do it because, you know, the processes, you know, set into motion led inexorably to this behavior, and why hold him responsible? I think another sphere of, you know, human thought and human thinking about morality that's touched by the neuroscience worldview is religion. Most religions think of a human being as partly physical and partly mental, that we have a soul or a spirit that is distinct from the body, including the brain. But again, if you kind of look at the general worldview that is emerging from neuroscience, everything we do, all of our personality traits, our kindnesses, our ability to empathize, our ability to know right from wrong, that's all just the computations of some neurons in our heads. What exactly is left over to be accounted for by this immaterial soul? So maybe as neuroscience kind of continues to fill out the picture of what a person is and how and why they behave the way they do, maybe that's going to undermine dualist notions of what a person is, including the notions that I think are central to a lot of religions. I had one other thought about this to share with you, but I can't remember what it is. So I will stop there and just say that these three types of issues in neuroethics are what we're going to be spending the rest of the semester talking about. And I think I've tried to sort of point out in advance how the concepts and distinctions that Autumn was introducing us to will be very fundamental and very helpful as we go through and work through the material for the rest of the semester. So thanks.